A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. During the 1800s, European societies were run by powerful monarchies and the social system of capitalism. Capitalism is a social system in which private property is owned and social classes exist. The kings, emperors, czars, and sultans ruled absolutely without any formal checks. Over 90% of people who lived during this era were living in horrible poverty and unpleasantness. The only people who were thriving during this period were the rich bourgeois class. The proletariat class was at the bottom of the social scale. They earned their money by selling their labor power and being paid a wage for their labor time to the bourgeois class. The bourgeois class owned all the factories in which the peasants or proletariat class worked in. The bourgeoisie has created enormous cities by attracting the peasants into the working factories, and thus producing more profit. The proletariats look upon the bourgeoisie as their only resource for survival, and vice versa. After the publication of the Communist Manifesto in the mid-1800s, Karl Marx's philosophy of communism spread throughout the world. The manifesto resulted in a world-changing form of government. This was in part thanks to Marx's theory regarding redistributing the wealth of the people, abolishing private property, and promoting equality between all social classes. While attending the University of Berlin, Karl Marx came up with many theories about the nature of man. In his works, he wrote that he believed Europe was on the verge of a reaction and revolution. Marx believed that the conditions in European countries were dark, cruel, and unlivable, and that man was cut off from its true nature. By the end of 1844, Marx began his lifelong friendship with Friedrich Engels. Together, Marx and Engels produced many works that describe the conditions of the working class. During this time, Marx and Engels started forming their versions of what communism and socialism really were. Marx and Engels were atheist socialists, which meant they desired a vicious revolution over the bourgeois class, led by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then, in 1847, Marx and Engels organized a group which they named the Communist League. This group was made up of exiled German intellectuals. Within months of the League being formed, the Communist Manifesto was published. Marx and Engels focused mainly on the struggles of the lower class. They believed it was unfair the way the bourgeoisie were using the peasants for production purposes. The working conditions in which the proletariat class worked were noted by Marx as ghastly and unbearable. Marx developed principles that would form communism as a whole. These principles are as follows: abolition of private property and using it for public purposes, steady income tax, abolition of the right to inheritance, confiscation of all immigrants and rebels, unification of the people's money in the hands of the National Bank, unification of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the government, expansion of factories and tools of production owned by the government, equal legal responsibilities to all who work, combining the agriculture industry with the manufacturing industries to lessen the distinction between town and country, free education for all children, and abolition of children's labor in factories. Marx noted that if these principles were followed, they would cause class distinction to disappear. The actions that Marx made stood alone in front of the world. Nothing like his ideas were known to man before his lifetime. Marx wanted a revolution to form against the bourgeois class by overthrowing it. The start of the Russian Revolution was when the workers, men and women of factories, took on strikes throughout Petrograd, now known to us as St. Petersburg, capital of Russia in the early 1900s. They marched with banners striking for higher pay and shorter labor hours. Vladimir Lenin saw the working class as in need of leadership. He organized an underground newspaper called The Spark. Lenin believed the paper could unify and organize the working class. Lenin, with help from Leon Trotsky, supported strikes and distributed Marxist literature to working men and women. Lenin and Trotsky also traveled around Russia, talking to peasants about how Marxism could unify Russia. They also told peasants to revolt against their landlord and to take over the farm in which they worked desperately on. This was a Marxist idea. In early October of 1917, Lenin's dream became a reality when he convinced the Bolshevik Party to form an immediate rebellion against the provisional government. With help from the Red Guards, who were armed factory workers, they seized post offices, telegraph offices, electric works, railroad stations, and state banks. Once they completed the siege, they stormed the Winter Palace. The Bolsheviks arrested the cabinet ministers, and on the 26th of October 1917, the provisional government had officially fallen to the Bolshevik rule. Years after the Russian Revolution and Lenin's death, a man took power who would leave an even greater mark than Lenin did. He would bring forth communist ideas that would reflect Marx in the past. In 1924, Joseph Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin thought that Russia was very behind in modernizing the economy. The first thing Stalin did was that he set up the 5-year plan. The first 5-year plan was introduced in 1928. Stalin demanded high increases in coal, iron, transport, and electric productions. By doing this, the plan created more jobs for working-class men and women. The second 5-year plan was meant to reward the people for how much they worked. If a person exceeded his daily work goal, then he would be rewarded with higher pay and better housing. But if he fell behind schedule, then he would be punished. This was a way in which the government encouraged people to take pride in their work. Another communist movement also took place in China in 1949 under the control of Mao Zedong. He was the founder of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese Communist Party's principles were shaped by mostly Marx's, Lenin's, Stalin's, and by Mao's personal ideas to form Maoism. Mao saw humans connected in an everlasting struggle against nature. He also saw societies being challenged by class struggles in China, and that the only way to resolve the struggles was by a revolution. This was a Marxist idea. The legacy of communism is still alive in China today. Thanks to Lenin and Stalin, the theory has been reinforced with their own opinions. Most of the policies used by the Communist government of China were created by Karl Marx 150 years ago. The policies that are used in the government in China and were created by Marx are as follows. There are no rights of private property in China. The state could take your house away if you spoke against the government. This connects with Marx because he believed there shouldn't be a thing as private property. All the money of the people is placed in the People's Bank of China and redistributed equally. This connects with Marx because he suggested that the money of the people should be placed in the hands of the government and redistributed equally among the citizens. All citizens of China must pay taxes. This connects with Marx because he once said that there should be a steady income tax so that the government can use the money for community purposes. There are no social classes in China. Everyone is treated equally and paid the same. This connects with Marx because one of his main principles was the abolition of social classes. Another country that follows the basis of Marxism is Cuba, with guidelines regarding redistribution of the wealth, free health care, free education, and still limited rights to private property. The long-term impact of what Karl Marx did for the world was he created the foundations on which other philosophers kept building up upon. He came up with the basis of a world-changing form of government. Communism is a radical form of government because no other form of government abolishes private property. To this day, there are exactly 5 communist countries: China, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam. Although some of the policies by which the countries run by have been modified, they still follow the same basic principles that came out of one single book, the Communist Manifesto.